The House
policies
chamber
are
was
as
already electric
outdated
before
as
the
your
hearing even
hairstyle,
began.
sir.
Staffers shuffled nervously, reporters leaned forward with their fingers poised over keyboards, and the witnesses at the front table exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone could sense it. Representative Ilhan Omar had come ready for confrontation. And Senator John Neely Kennedy, calm and steady as a mountain, was seated across from her, reviewing a single sheet of notes with the quiet focus of a man who never needed theatrics to command a room. Omar wasted no time. The moment the hearing opened, she went straight at Kennedy, not on policy, not on evidence, but with a petty jab wrapped in a smirk. "Senator," she said loudly enough for the cameras to pick up every syllable, "perhaps if your accent didn't sound like it came straight out of a 1950s backwoods radio show, you'd understand what we're discussing." A few gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "Did she really just say that?" Reporters practically lunged for their phones. Kennedy didn't react, not a flinch, not a twitch, not even a raised eyebrow. He simply closed the folder in front of him, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at Omar with the quiet patience of a man who'd watched louder, prouder people fall apart under their own disrespect. His stillness made the moment even heavier. Omar, sensing attention shifting toward her, pressed harder. "We're here to talk about national security, Senator. Not, whatever small-town storytelling cadence you insist on using." She let out a small, mocking laugh. Cameras zoomed in. Staffers winced. But Kennedy just waited, calm, steady, letting her dig the hole deeper. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shaken. He had spent decades debating people far sharper, far tougher, far better prepared than this. What Omar didn't understand was simple: when she reached for a personal insult, Kennedy saw it for what it truly was, proof she was already losing the argument. And the room sensed it too. Her tone was all heat, no substance. Kennedy's silence, on the other hand, carried more weight than any outburst could. His eyes stayed locked on Omar, unbothered, unafraid, already choosing the exact moment he would strike back, not with volume, but with undeniable force. What Omar didn't know was that the comeback he was holding in his pocket wouldn't just silence her. It would lift the entire chamber to its feet. The moment Ilhan Omar leaned into her microphone, the room shifted. Her tone sharpened, her expression tightened, and she spoke with the unmistakable intention of provoking a reaction, not from the witnesses, not from the committee, but directly from Senator John Kennedy. "Maybe," she said, raising an eyebrow, "if the senator could pronounce half of these terms correctly, we wouldn't be wasting the committee's time." A few gasps scattered across the chamber. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't policy-based. It was personal. An open jab at Kennedy's Louisiana accent, made on the official record. Omar sat back, clearly pleased with herself. She'd thrown the punch she'd prepared, certain it would rattle him. But Kennedy didn't even blink. No tightening jaw. No flinch. No retaliatory glare. He simply adjusted his glasses and made a small note on the paper in front of him, as if marking the exact second she walked into her own mistake. Staffers shifted uneasily. Even members who usually aligned with Omar looked uncomfortable. Attacking someone's ideas was one thing. Mocking their background, especially their roots, was an entirely different battlefield. Kennedy finally raised his head, calm as a still lake. "Congresswoman," he said in his low, measured voice, "I may talk a little slower than you like, but I listen a whole lot better than you do." A murmur rolled through the room. Omar opened her mouth, but Kennedy wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, eyes steady, voice unwavering. "And where I come from, ma'am, we judge people on their character, not on the way they sound." The reaction was instant. Chairs shifted. Staffers froze mid-note. Even reporters, trained to remain neutral, lifted their heads. Kennedy hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted her back. He simply used precision, truth sharpened into a scalpel. Omar blinked, visibly thrown off, her plan slipping from her hands like sand. The jab she expected to land had boomeranged straight back at her. And everyone saw it. Kennedy closed his folder softly, almost politely, signaling he was ready for her next move, because now, the momentum belonged entirely to him. The chamber tightened as Ilhan Omar leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, lips curved into a thin, mocking smile, the kind meant to provoke. Moments earlier, she had taken a jab not at Kennedy's policy, not at his record, but at his accent, twisting her voice into a crude imitation of his Louisiana drawl. A few staffers winced. A couple of partisan allies stifled laughter. Omar believed she had landed a clean strike, something that would rattle Kennedy, something she could spin into a viral clip. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He didn't even lift an eyebrow. Instead, he calmly adjusted his glasses and glanced around the room like a man checking the weather before stepping outside. His restraint made Omar's mockery hang in the air longer than she expected, too long. The silence didn't hum, it throbbed. Even the stenographers paused, sensing the moment tightening. Omar pushed further, doubling down, her tone sharper this time. "Maybe if we could understand him more clearly," she said, waving a hand dismissively, "we'd get better answers." A few murmurs rippled through the audience, not approval, not humor, but discomfort. Her comment wasn't clever, it was petty. And in Washington, petty rarely ages well. Kennedy slowly straightened in his chair, finally giving Omar his full attention. The room leaned with him, instinctively waiting. He folded his hands, his expression a blend of patience and steel, an expression he wore whenever someone mistook his accent for ignorance. "Congresswoman," he said calmly, his voice steady and sharp enough to cut through the tension, "I'm from Louisiana. We speak plainly there. We don't confuse volume with intelligence, and we don't confuse mockery with an argument." A pulse went through the room, soft gasps, a shifting of posture, a sudden stillness from Omar. Kennedy hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The force of the line came from its precision, not its pitch. His words weren't defensive, they were corrective. Omar blinked, taken aback. For the first time that morning, her confidence wavered. She had expected flustered frustration, maybe indignation. Instead, she got something far more dangerous: clarity. Kennedy had turned her insult into a spotlight, and she was the one standing under it. And the room knew it. The room was buzzing with a low, uneasy tension after Omar's jab about Kennedy's accent, but when she leaned forward for her next attack, the atmosphere thickened like a storm cloud ready to split open. She adjusted her microphone, angled her shoulders, and delivered her line with a rehearsed sharpness designed to sting. "Senator, maybe if you spent less time sounding like a small-town caricature and more time understanding real policy, we'd get somewhere." A few staffers behind her smirked. One reporter raised an eyebrow, ready to tweet. Omar folded her arms, fully convinced she had cornered him, certain she had landed the punch that would rattle him in front of the cameras. Kennedy didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't even shift in his chair. Instead, he slowly straightened his paperwork, calmly capped his pen, and lifted his gaze with that unmistakable Louisiana cool that always made the room lean in. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice warm, steady, unmistakably Southern, "if the worst thing you can say about me is that I sound like the people I represent, well, sugar, that says more about you than it does about me." A soft gasp swept through the chamber. Omar's smirk faltered. Kennedy wasn't finished. He leaned forward just slightly, measured, confident, controlled. "You can mock my accent all day long," he continued, "but I'll take honesty with a drawl over arrogance with a microphone any day of the week." Reporters jerked their heads up. Staffers froze mid-note. One witness even whispered, "Wow," under his breath. But Kennedy still wasn't done. He delivered the final line like a clean, practiced strike, respectful, firm, and devastatingly effective. "And just so we're clear, Congresswoman. I'd rather sound like home than sound condescending." The chamber erupted, not with chaos, but with applause, loud enough that even the chair had to tap the gavel. Omar's posture stiffened as she swallowed, suddenly very aware of how the momentum had shifted. Kennedy didn't revel in it. He didn't gloat. He simply sat back, calm as ever, letting the room's reaction speak for him. He had turned her mockery into a moment of unity, and completely flipped the hearing on its head. The tension in the chamber thickened the moment Ilhan Omar leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, a smug half-smile tugging at the corner of her mouth as if she believed she had landed a decisive blow. Her earlier jab at Kennedy's southern accent still hung in the air, an underhanded insult masked as political critique. A few staffers shifted uncomfortably. Even some of Omar's usual allies stared down at their notes, realizing she had crossed a line she shouldn't have. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He never did. He simply adjusted his glasses, glanced at his notebook, and let a moment of silence stretch, long enough for everyone in the room to feel it. Kennedy understood the power of timing better than any politician in Washington. It wasn't just about what you said, but when you said it. When he finally lifted his eyes, his expression was calm, steady, and razor-sharp beneath the surface. Omar didn't notice the shift. She mistook his composure for weakness, leaning forward as if preparing for round two. "Senator, maybe if your state focused less on folksy charm and more on real policy," she began, but Kennedy held up a single finger. Not rudely. Not aggressively. Just enough to command the room. The chamber fell silent instantly. Even the cameras zoomed in. "Congresswoman," Kennedy said evenly, his voice carrying that unmistakable Louisiana warmth she had just mocked, "in my state, we teach folks not to confuse volume with wisdom. And we sure don't mistake cheap shots for arguments." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Omar's confident expression faltered. Kennedy wasn't raising his voice or escalating. He didn't need to. His words hit harder because they were delivered with precision, not anger. "You can make fun of how I talk," Kennedy continued, leaning forward slightly, "but what you can't do is explain why your plan costs billions without helping the people you claim to represent." A few staffers gasped quietly. Omar opened her mouth, searching for a rebuttal, but Kennedy wasn't finished. "So if you're done commenting on accents, we can return to discussing policy, assuming you brought any." The room shifted. Chairs tightened. Even reporters froze, fingers hovering over keyboards. For the first time, Omar had no immediate comeback. Kennedy had done more than defend himself. He had turned the insult into a spotlight, and now it was shining on her. The room was still buzzing from Kennedy's last line, a perfect blend of southern charm and razor-sharp precision, the kind only he could deliver without raising his voice. But Ilhan Omar, visibly frustrated that her earlier jab hadn't landed, leaned forward again, determined to reclaim control. Her tone sharpened, her eyes narrowing as she tried to steer the moment back in her favor. "Senator, maybe if your accent didn't get in the way, people would understand what you're trying to say," Omar snapped, her words slicing through the chamber like a cold draft. A few gasps echoed across the hearing room. Staffers froze. Witnesses stiffened. Even cameras zoomed in, sensing the shift from tension to outright insult. Omar thought she'd finally hit him where it hurt. But Kennedy didn't flinch. Not an inch. He simply adjusted his glasses, folded his hands, and looked at her with the calm, seasoned patience of a man who had seen these tactics for decades, and beaten them all. His silence alone made Omar fidget in her seat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the steady, unmistakable weight of authority. "Congresswoman," he said, slow and deliberate, "I may talk with an accent, but at least I say something when I speak. An accent's never stopped me from telling the truth." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Omar blinked, caught off guard. Kennedy wasn't done. "And just for the record," he continued, leaning slightly toward his mic, where I'm from, we consider mocking someone's roots the same as admitting you don't have an argument left." The back of the chamber shook with suppressed laughter. A witness cracked a smile. One of the reporters mouthed, "Wow." Omar's composure slipped, her posture tightening as she searched for a retort she didn't have. Kennedy's accent hadn't weakened him, it had disarmed her. And now, the momentum in the room had shifted entirely. "Now," Kennedy said, straightening in his chair, "if you're done with the comments about where I was born, maybe we can get back to where you went wrong in your questioning." This time, the laughter couldn't be held back. It broke across the chamber in a sudden wave. Staffers, reporters, even a few members on Omar's side couldn't contain themselves. Omar's face tightened as she realized the truth. Her mockery hadn't just failed, it had backfired so hard that Kennedy had the whole room behind him. The chamber had gone from amused murmurs to full, electrified tension, because everyone knew Ilhan Omar had finally crossed a line she couldn't walk back. Her mockery of Kennedy's southern accent had already backfired once, but now she doubled down, leaning into the microphone with a smirk that carried more arrogance than strategy. "Senator," she said slowly, exaggerating each syllable as if she were performing for a late-night comedy show, "maybe if your district weren't stuck 50 years behind the rest of the country, you'd understand what we're discussing." Gasps rippled through the room. Even members who normally aligned with Omar stiffened in their seats. Staffers froze mid-note-taking. A reporter near the front whispered, "Oh no," under his breath. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't oversight or passion, this was disrespect aimed at a man who had spent decades serving the people of Louisiana with dignity, and tonight, the chamber wouldn't let that slide. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply adjusted his glasses, the gesture slow and deliberate, the posture of a man who had just been handed the easiest victory of his week. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm, the kind of steady tone that told the room he'd already won before even delivering the blow. "Congresswoman," he began, leaning toward his mic, "Louisiana may talk a little slower than you." A few quiet laughs scattered, waiting for what was coming. "But we think a whole lot faster." Laughter burst across the room, big, unrestrained, unstoppable. Even a few committee members who rarely broke composure had to fight to hide their smiles. Omar stiffened, her earlier confidence evaporating as Kennedy continued, still perfectly composed, "And as for my accent, ma'am, it's the sound of people who work real jobs, raise real families, and don't need Washington elites teaching them how to speak." More applause. Louder this time. Staffers tapped their desks. A reporter's keyboard went wild as he typed. Kennedy wasn't just defending himself, he was defending everyone Omar had insulted with that single careless jab. Omar tried to interject, but this time she was drowned out, not by hostility, but by applause, by the overwhelming sound of a room acknowledging that Kennedy had spoken the truth plainly, confidently, and without a hint of malice. And in that moment, Omar realized she hadn't mocked one man, she'd mocked an entire state. And Kennedy had made sure the chamber understood it. The chamber had gone from restless whispers to full-scale tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavier, every movement sharper. After Ilhan Omar's failed attempts to belittle Kennedy over his accent and his home state, the room had begun to turn, first quietly, then unmistakably. Staffers exchanged glances. Reporters raised their phones a little higher. Even members of Omar's own side shifted in their chairs, sensing the tide tilting away from her. But Omar hadn't realized it yet. She leaned forward again, gripping the microphone with a confidence that had started to crack around the edges. "Senator," she said, letting the word drip with disdain, "maybe if you spent less time telling folksy stories and more time educating yourself, this chamber wouldn't have to repeat every question for you." A couple of gasps broke out. One aide actually covered his mouth. Kennedy didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at her with that calm, unbothered expression that always meant trouble for whoever stood on the other side. When he spoke, his voice carried a levelness that cut sharper than any shout ever could. "Congresswoman," he replied, I don't need a lecture on education from someone who can't tell the difference between an argument and an insult. The room jolted. A few chuckles slipped out before people could stop themselves. Omar stiffened. Kennedy pressed on. You've mocked where I'm from. You've mocked how I speak. But you still haven't answered the question I've asked 3 times now. And I suspect, he slowed, letting the moment breathe, that the reason you keep attacking me personally is because you can't answer it. This time the room didn't just react, it cracked open. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some members actually leaned back, impressed despite themselves. Omar tried to regain her footing. Don't twist this, she began. Kennedy cut in, not rudely, but with precision. I'm not twisting anything, Congresswoman. I'm asking for clarity. You chose deflection. You chose snark. And now you're choosing outrage. But what you're not choosing is accountability. The chamber fell silent. Kennedy's words hung in the air like a verdict. Even cameras shifted toward him, recognizing the moment. Omar opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Not a prepared talking point, not a punchline, not a comeback. Because for the first time that session, she wasn't in control of the narrative. The chamber was still buzzing from Kennedy's last exchange, a moment that had flipped the hearing upside down. Staffers whispered to one another, reporters typed furiously, and even members who normally avoided taking sides found themselves leaning forward, waiting to see how he would close out what had quickly become the most talked-about confrontation of the week. But Ilhan Omar, still stung from having her earlier mockery turned against her, made one last attempt to claw back control. She leaned into her microphone, voice measured but strained, trying to disguise the frustration tightening her jaw. Senator Kennedy, she said, with all due respect, theatrics might impress your followers, but they don't change the facts. You can't dance around policy shortcomings forever. There it was, the final swing. A last-ditch effort to paint Kennedy as evasive, unfocused, unserious. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't shuffle papers, didn't glance at aides, didn't even shift in his seat. He simply lifted his eyes, calm as a man who had already won the fight and knew the room knew it too. Congresswoman, he replied, voice steady and carried effortlessly through the chamber, if I wanted theatrics, I'd go to Broadway. What I'm doing here is answering questions. What you're doing is avoiding them. A few heads snapped upward. A staffer coughed to cover a laugh. Omar straightened in her chair, clearly not expecting him to fire back with such precision. Kennedy continued, weaving the perfect blend of clarity and sting. You keep calling my words theatrics because it's easier than confronting reality. I'm using facts. I know that must feel unusual to you today. A ripple of suppressed laughter cut through the room. Omar opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't finished. And one more thing, he added, leaning slightly forward. If you're going to accuse me of dancing around issues, you might want to stop tiptoeing around your own. That line detonated. A burst of applause erupted. Spontaneous, loud, unrestrained. Even members who rarely reacted during hearings couldn't hide their reactions. Omar froze, blinking as if she hadn't processed what just happened. Kennedy didn't smile, didn't gloat, he simply sat back, letting the room's reaction speak for him. Because at that moment, it wasn't just a comeback. It was the moment the entire chamber realized Kennedy had controlled the hearing from the start. The chamber was no longer the same room Ilhan Omar had walked into at the start of the hearing. The tension she had created with her mockery had evaporated, replaced by a steady hum of anticipation, every member present now watching Senator John Kennedy as if waiting for the final strike in a match he was clearly winning. Even the witnesses, who had stayed quiet through the heated exchange, leaned in with a mixture of relief and respect. Omar, who had spent the earlier part of the hearing smirking, had gone silent. Her posture, once sharp and confrontational, had softened. She shuffled her papers, avoiding eye contact with Kennedy, understanding full well that her attempt to undermine him had not only failed but had backfired before the entire chamber. Kennedy adjusted his glasses slowly, deliberately, never rushing, always in command of his space. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone measured but carrying the weight of a gavel, "in Louisiana, we may speak with accents, but we don't speak with contempt." A few members suppressed laughs. Others didn't bother hiding them. He continued, "And where I come from, we focus on solutions. Not insults. Not theatrics. And certainly not belittling where a person was raised." Omar swallowed hard. Kennedy looked toward the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I believe the American people deserve more than mockery of where someone comes from. They deserve clarity, honesty, and leadership that doesn't crumble the moment it's challenged." A murmur swept through the room. Then he delivered the line that finished the entire debate. "If Congresswoman Omar wants to mock the way folks talk back home, that's her business. But if she wants to mock the truth, well, that's when she'll have to answer to me." The chamber erupted. Not in chaos but in applause. Real, loud, sustained applause that echoed under the lights. Staffers exchanged stunned looks. Reporters tapped furiously on their phones. Several members nodded, acknowledging what everyone understood. Kennedy had restored control of the hearing and reminded Congress what real leadership sounded like. Omar sank back in her seat, her earlier bravado gone completely. The hearing had slipped from her grasp the moment she underestimated Kennedy, and she knew it. And Kennedy? He simply leaned back in his chair, hands folded, expression calm. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't hurled an insult, hadn't played to the cameras. He had just told the truth. And the room had risen to its feet. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today wasn't just another heated exchange in Congress. It was a reminder of something far more important, that respect, honesty, and integrity still matter in public life." While Representative Omar tried to turn a serious discussion into a personal mockery, Senator John Kennedy showed the nation what real leadership looks like. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult her back. He simply answered with truth, clarity, and courage, and the entire room responded. Moments like this remind us why Kennedy continues to earn the trust of everyday Americans. He stands firm, he stays calm, and he speaks with the kind of common-sense wisdom that cuts through noise and nonsense. And tonight, he didn't just win an argument, he restored the tone of the entire chamber. Thank you for watching, and if you want more stories where real leadership shines through, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. There's a lot more to come.